Proposal 60, Part 1, as amended, will stand part. Members, we now come to debate on Part 2. This is debate on clauses 27 and 28 and Schedule 2. The question is that Part 2 stand part.
Mr Chairman.
Chris Hipkins, first.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. It's about time. Mr Chairman, I want to know, this Part 2 deals with the transition provisions relating to proposals made before this bill came into effect. So I want to know, does these transitional provisions apply to the secret deal that Nick Smith cooked up with Fran Wild over a year ago to do with the Wellington region? Will these transitional provisions apply to that? Because we know that Nick Smith cooked up a deal with Fran Wild over a year ago to reform our local government in the Wellington area, And the provisions that have been enacted in Part 1 means that Wellingtonians won't get a chance to have a say on it. They won't get a chance to have a say on it unless they sign a petition demanding to have a referendum. Whereas at the moment, under the current law, they would get a chance to have a say on that. But I know Nick Smith knows better, and so he decided to do away with that. And the proposal that he has cooked up to reform local government in the Wellington area would potentially, because he hasn't been upfront about it, because it hasn't been a formal proposal, probably won't actually be covered by these transitional provisions, and I think that's disgraceful. I think that's disgraceful because that's what this government do. They actually don't have any respect for the democratic process. Nick Smith, the same minister who, when confronted with the reality that people in Christchurch didn't particularly like what the government was doing there, just decided that the best way to deal with that problem was to cancel the elections. Just don't have the elections. The government didn't want to know what the people of Christchurch actually thought. And to hear Nikki Wagner earlier on in this debate talking about the importance of grassroots democracy in Christchurch, and yet she has said absolutely nothing about the cancellation of local government elections in Christchurch. A member from Central Christchurch has had nothing to say about the cancellation of local government elections that her constituents are very upset about. They're very upset about that, and Nikki Wagner has not said one squeak in their defence. Not one squeak in their defence. And then she had the audacity to lecture the Parliament about the importance of grassroots democracy. This bill is a terrible piece of legislation. It narrows down the scope of local government. And I want to just draw the House's attention to one comment made at the Select Committee by someone who I respect the view of quite a lot, and that was Martin Sneddon. And I asked Martin Sneddon at the Select Committee hearing, what would the impact of this bill have been on the Rugby World Cup had it been in place when the Rugby World Cup actually took place last year? And Martin Sneddon's, I remember word for word what he said. He said, a lot of New Zealanders would have had a lot less fun. A lot of New Zealanders would have had a lot less fun. That's it. The national government don't like people having fun. They hate fun, in fact. They hate fun, they don't like it, and they hate democracy. And they're not interested in the views of the voting public because they command a majority in the House, and that's all they need to know. They'll shut down the debate when they don't like the points that the opposition are raising. They'll vote to shut down the debate when they don't like the cold, hard truth that comes out about the absolutely disgraceful attitude that they have shown to the democratic process in pushing this bill through. The people of my electorate are very concerned about this piece of legislation. And to come back to Part 2 and the transitional provisions that are contained in Part 2, the reason that the people in Upper Hutt are very concerned about this is they think their fate has already been sealed. They think the government have already decided what they want to do in the Wellington region, and they're just not being upfront and honest about that. The people of Upper Hutt want a say in what happens to their local government. And I can tell Nick Smith, he talked about his constituency survey, I do one of those as well. And overwhelmingly, the people in Upper Hutt do not want their local government to be the subject of amalgamation. Overwhelmingly, the people of Upper Hutt do not want their local government to disappear. But that doesn't worry Nick Smith, because he's already decided what he wants to see happen in the Wellington region. He's already decided, and even now, he's still not willing to get up on his pins and actually say what it is, and actually say what the decision-making is. But of course, we'll have to wait until he's reinstated to Cabinet before we find out what Nick Smith's proposal for the Wellington region is. But the people of Upper Hutt, who I represent and who I'm proud to represent, do not want to see Upper Hutt swallowed up in a Wellington super city like the national government do. And they took some, Mr Chairman.
Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. They took some heart from the Prime Minister's statement that we're not going to be, and John, I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said they're not going to force local government reform on the rest of New Zealand the way they did in Auckland. No forced amalgamations, and yet this bill allows them to do exactly that. Exactly that. It's another promise that John Key made that he had no intention of keeping. Because John Key's very much the Simon Says Prime Minister. You know, don't actually pay any attention to what I'm actually doing. Just listen to what I say. Regardless of what he's actually doing, he'll go out there and say one thing while his ministers and his government will do something completely different. That is National's approach to governing. As long as John Key can go out there and smile and wave for the crowds, he thinks that his ministers can get away with doing whatever they like. Whatever they like. And if that means that they bring legislation to the House that directly contradicts promises that John Key has made, he doesn't really care. He's probably quite relaxed about it, in fact. This is an anti-democratic piece of legislation that robs New Zealand citizens and the residents of who are subject to local authority rule in their area. It robs them of their democratic rights, because this government ultimately have no respect for the role of local government in their local communities, particularly not in Christchurch, where actually the role of local government in Christchurch after something as big as the earthquake is vital. Not just the City Council, but Environment Canterbury as well. And the national government's approach to that is to simply cancel all democratic participation in that process.
That's right.
Cancel the ability for the voters of Christchurch to have their say on issues to do with Environment Canterbury. And why did they do that? What was their justification? They were actually quite upfront about it. They were worried what the outcome of an election might be. There was that, and that's not a secret agenda. They were actually quite open about that. They actually went out there and said, we don't trust the people of Christchurch to make the right decisions in electing the right people to Environment Canterbury, so we'll simply cancel the elections. That's right. So they want to protect the water for their corporate dairy farming mates, as Phil Twyford just pointed out. This government have no respect for grassroots democracy. And I want to conclude with a quote from David Shearer's speech to the Labour Party conference last Sunday, when he said that the rebuild of Christchurch should be driven from the grassroots up and not the beehive down. And that is the absolutely right approach to the rebuild of Christchurch. This government don't want a bar of that. They don't want to hear what the local residents of Christchurch have to say, and if they have to cancel an election or two to make sure they don't get a chance to have a say, that's exactly what they'll do. And if they don't want, to hear the views of the people in Wellington about local government reorganisation either, and if they have to change the law to deny them their right to have a say on the local government reform in Wellington, that is exactly what they are going to do, and that is exactly what this bill does. This bill is an attack on local democracy. It should not be passed by this House. The people who are voting in favour of it, and in particular, a local Wellington member voting in favour of it by the name of Peter Dunn, should be ashamed of themselves for their support for this. This goes against so many of the things Peter Dunn tells his local citizens, his local constituents that he supports. It goes against so many of the promises that he has made to local people about his respect for their views and for his respect for their democratic rights. And I'm very, very disappointed that Peter Dunn is supporting this piece of legislation. It's bad legislation, and we will be voting against it.
Mr Chairman,
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Chairman, I just want to make a brief